In this presentation, we will take a look at multiple choice questions related to responsibility accounting, going through the questions and then practicing test taking skills with them. First question, difficult part in calculating the costs and expenses of a department. A, determining net income. B, assigning direct costs to the department. C, allocating indirect expenses to the department. D, determining the amount of sales of the department, or E, determining the standard expenses of the department. So let's go through this again using the process of elimination. Difficult part in calculating the costs and expenses of a department is either A, determining net income. So we might say, that sounds, it could be kind of difficult. We'll keep that. B says assigning direct costs to the department. Now, this says B says assigning direct costs, and C says allocating indirect expenses to the department. Of those two, between the direct and indirect, the difficult part, the more difficult one, you would think would be assigning the indirect, because we have to go through some process to do so. The direct expenses would be directly allocated because they're from and incurred within that department. So I'm going to say B's not it. If of those two, I would think C would be the answer. D says determining the amount of sales of the department. Now, to determine the amount of sales of a department shouldn't be that difficult because, of course, we're going to track that as they make the sales by the department usually. So it's not something we usually have to assign to different departments because we're going to pretty closely track the sales generally by department. So that should be fairly easy to do. And then E says determining the standard expenses of the department. Determining the standard expenses possibly. I'll keep that for now. Let's go through this again. Difficult part in calculating the costs and expenses of a department is either A, determining net income, C, allocating indirect expenses to the department, or E, determining the standard expenses of the department. Now, if you think about E, the standard expenses, standard is something we often use in kind of cost variance analysis or budgeting type of numbers, standard costs. It's not, and that would be comparing actual to the budget. So standards would be more like budgeted numbers. And we're not talking about budgeted or numbers or standards. We're talking about part to calculate the cost, the actual cost. So it's not really E. And then between A and C, A's determine net income. Now that could be kind of difficult of the department. The difficult component of calculating the net income, however, is the allocating indirect expenses to the department. So typically this is the one that's going to be causing us problems. How do we allocate the indirect expenses to the department? So C is the final answer. Difficult part in calculating costs and expenses of a department. C, allocating indirect expenses to the department. Next question. Which is not a step in creating operating department income statements? A, prepare the departmental income statement. B, accumulate revenues and direct expenses by department. C, allocate indirect expenses across departments. D, allocate service department expenses to operating departments. Or E, eliminate the uncontrollable costs for each department. Okay, let's go through this again using the process of elimination, which is not a step in creating operating department income statements. So operating department income statements. A, preparing the department income statements. So actually to actually prepare them, that seems like it's going to be necessary. B says accumulate revenues and direct expenses by department. So revenues and direct expenses by department, that seems like we'd have to do that for a departmental income statement. C says allocate indirect expenses across departments. Now again, those are those expenses that are going to be involved in multiple departments. We're going to have to allocate them in some way. So you would think that would be appropriate. D says allocate service department expenses to operating departments. Now of all these, this one seems like the most abstract possibly, so we'll keep that for now. And E says eliminate the uncontrollable costs for each department. And that sounds kind of like reasonable if we were talking about responsibility accounting. So let's go through this again. Which is not a step in creating operating department income statements? D, allocating service department expenses to operating departments, or E, eliminate the uncontrollable costs for each department. Now, of those two, note that if we're creating the departmental income statement, we are going to allocate the indirect expenses, and we are typically going to be allocating the service departments to the operating departments. The service departments which don't have any revenue within them, typically will allocate those to the operating departments. So E, you might think sounds reasonable, but that's when we're basically, if we're judging the performance, responsibility accounting, that's when we might eliminate the uncontrollable costs in order for us to judge the performance. However, here we're talking like at the operating department income statement, at which point we will be allocating, the indirect costs, which may include uncontrollable costs as well as the service department expenses to the operating departments. So the final answer is E, which is not going to be included. So it is, which is not a step in creating operating department income statements. E, eliminate the uncontrollable costs for each department.